Good evening, and welcome back to another session of Conversations with Dr. Lily. So, today's topic is called The Hidden Predator: Understanding Female Narcissists and Women with Antisocial Personality Traits. And we're going to be diving into a topic that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Because when people typically think of narcissists or sociopaths, they usually think of men. But women can also display these traits, but they often look different than how they appear in men. So today's episode is not about demonizing women, and it's not about diagnosing them, but it's about educating, bringing awareness, and recognizing unhealthy relationship patterns before they become destructive. So some of the things that I will be discussing tonight is what narcissism really is, what antisocial personality is, whether people are born this way or become this way, so the nature versus nurture, what research will tell us about the brains of people with these personality disorders, some red flags in dating and marriage, some of the manipulation tactics, and we'll also talk about why female offenders are often underestimated and then how these personalities may appear inside of a courtroom. So let's first go over again narcissists versus sociopaths. So people often will use these words interchangeably, but they do describe different personality patterns. A narcissist will primarily seek admiration, validation, status, and control. A sociopath, or someone with antisocial personality disorder, because as we learned last week, it is not a diagnosis. Sociopath is not a diagnosis. But they are more focused on power, exploitation, manipulation, and personal gain, often with very little regard for the rights of others. So if you think of it this way, a narcissist will ask, how can I get people to admire me? While a sociopath may ask, how can I use people? And again, there are people who display characteristics of both. So you need to be very careful with those people. So now we'll talk about nature versus nurture. Where do these personalities come from? This has been a debate among psychologists for decades, and the answer appears to be both. So genetically, research suggests that genetics account for a significant portion of the risk for both narcissist and antisocial personality traits. But temperament is partly inherited. So some children will naturally have a lower fear response and have higher sensation seeking with reduced emotional sensitivity. Someone's childhood environment can also play a significant factor because genetics alone do not tell the whole story. So some of the childhood experiences associated with higher risks will include emotional neglect, inconsistent parenting, abuse, excessive criticism, or excessive praise with no accountability, chaotic homes, a lack of empathy from their caregivers, and then some children will adapt by believing that they have to become superior, and others will conclude that they can't trust anyone. And some of them just simply learn it because that's how they see relationships function in their own homes. So now we'll talk about what the brain looks like. And this is a fascinating area of research because studies suggest that some individuals with high levels of psychopathic or antisocial traits will show differences in areas of the brain that involve emotion, fear processing, empathy, and impulse control. So typically they have studied the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the anterior cingulate cortex. And some of those studies have found that the reduced emotional responsiveness to others' distress or fear is one of the main factors. But again, this does not diagnose someone as having a personality disorder. And it does not mean that someone has no emotions. They actually will be able to experience emotions, but they do not have empathy because they cannot genuinely understand or feel another person's suffering. So, let's dive into how this plays into female narcissists. And like I said before, female narcissists often differ than men. So instead of obvious grandiosity like males, their manipulation can appear more relational. So some of the common behaviors will include playing the victim, triangulation, gossiping, destroying somebody's reputation, using emotional manipulation. They're passive aggressive, have controlling friendships, often use guilt. They will love bomb, withhold affections, give the silent treatment, have jealousy, and are extremely jealous. They'll need constant validation, and they always will blame others. And many of them will appear very charming in public, but behind closed doors, it is a whole nother story. So, some of the sociopathic traits that females may display is, again, high manipulation, but it's more strategic. So, some of those warning signs will include pathological lying, using people for their financial gain, having a lack of remorse, repeated deception, have multiple overlapping relationships. So they basically never completely end a relationship before jumping into another one. They often have false victimization, they exploit emotions, they gaslight, they'll use children as leverage, and they love creating chaos for their entertainment. And again, they destroy relationships and reputations, and they will use false allegations when they feel like their control is threatened. And then again, these behaviors alone do not establish a diagnosis, but the persistent patterns are what we need to take a deeper dive into. And men will often miss some of these signs because they're typically taught that either abuse is only physical or that men don't get abused, and they especially don't get abused by women. But as we know, psychological abuse is very devastating and potentially worse than physical abuse. So some of the things you want to watch out for if you're a man is that everything becomes your fault and you're the one constantly apologizing. You begin to question your own memory. You start to lose your confidence. You stop seeing your friends and you feel like you're walking on eggshells, and nothing that you do is ever enough. And then every disagreement that you have, it somehow becomes about how you are a failure or that you have failed. And then they often, as we know, use manipulation tactics. So again, love bombing, future faking, gaslighting, projections, smear campaigns, triangulation, intermittent reinforcement, hoovering, financial control, isolation, and sex is used as a reward or as punishment. And they will make false accusations, play the perpetual victim. And I know I read off some terms that might not be familiar to people, so I'm going to dive a little deeper into those. So future faking happens when someone makes grand promises about the future so that they can gain your trust, your commitment, or your compliance despite having no intention of following through. But the goal is to keep you emotionally invested. So some examples may include, we're going to get married next year, or once I get this promotion, we'll buy that dream home. I'm going to change, just give me one more chance. Or we're going to travel the world together. And then months or even years will pass and nothing changes. But the reason that it works is because future promises trigger hope. And hope often causes people to overlook the present behavior. And so victims begin focusing on what could be instead of what is. Some of the warning signs that you need to look out for are lots of promises, very little to no action, endless excuses, and the timelines will constantly move. And the future is always just around the corner, but the future never comes. That corner is never there. Another term I used was projection. So, projection is a psychological defense mechanism in which someone attributes their own thoughts, feelings, motives, or behaviors to another person. So, instead of acknowledging they have their own shortcomings, they will accuse someone else of them. So, some examples of this is if someone is cheating, they will say, I think you're cheating," or they will accuse you of cheating. Someone who's lying says, "You're always being dishonest." Someone who is manipulative says, "You're always trying to manipulate me." And why this happens is because admitting wrongdoing threatens their self image. And that is the thing that holds them together. Because as we discussed, they have a very fragile ego. And so to admit that they are not as superior and as perfect as what they have created in their minds is like a killer blow to them. And it is psychologically easier to believe that someone else is guilty versus you owning up to your mistakes. So, in relationships, projection will often cause victims to become defensive about things that they never even did. And then eventually will begin to question themselves. So, the next term we'll talk about is triangulation. So, triangulation will occur when someone brings a third person into a conflict to create competition, jealousy, division, or control. So instead of solving the problem directly, they will manipulate relationships between multiple people. Some examples would be, "I wish you were more like my ex," or "My coworkers think that you're overreacting," and "My mother agrees with me," "My lawyer says that you're impossible," "My therapist says that you're the narcissist." And so some types of triangulation can include romantic rivals, parents, children, friends, coworkers, attorneys, judges, therapists, social media followers. And the goal of it is to create insecurity in the victim and also to create competition because it makes the victim feel isolated and it helps the abuser to maintain power. So now we'll talk about hoovering. And this is a term that I don't think I have ever heard, but it makes a lot of sense. And it is named after the Hoover vacuum cleaner. But the definition is that it refers to someone who attempts to suck someone back into a relationship after they have left or they have established boundaries. So some examples that a person will use would be like, "I've changed," or "I've gone to therapy," or "I'm in therapy now." "I can't live without you." "I finally understand everything now. I'll never do it again." And then sometimes the person will return with flowers, gifts, apologies. They'll send Bible verses or love letters or drop by unexpectedly. Or they'll have significant health scares or financial emergencies. So then the cycle will become a pattern of love bombing, then devaluation, then they will discard you, and then they will start the hoovering process, and then they will repeat it all. So love bombing, devaluation, discard, hoovering, repeat. And the goal of this is to regain access, attention, or control. And it's not to build a healthy relationship, it's simply for the control. And then we'll talk about intermittent reinforcement. So, this occurs when affection, approval, attention, or rewards are given unpredictably rather than consistently. And the unpredictability can make I can't talk. The unpredictability can make relationships especially difficult to leave because, like, on Monday, they'll say "I love you." On Tuesday, they completely ignore you. On Wednesday, you guys go out for a romantic dinner. Then on Thursday, it's complete silent treatment. And then Friday, it's amazing intimacy. And then Saturday, you're being cruelly criticized. And Sunday, it's as if nothing happened. And because of this, the victim never knows what version of the person they're going to encounter. And it is so powerful because the pattern activates the brain's reward system. Because the unpredictable rewards can become especially compelling because the brain keeps anticipating the next positive experience. And this is similar to why variable reward schedules are effective in contexts like gambling. But the result of this is that victims often become increasingly focused on earning the return of the loving version of the person rather than evaluating whether the relationship is healthy overall. And these tactics are so effective because all of them target the fundamental human needs. So, future faking targets hope, projection creates self doubt, triangulation triggers insecurity and competition, and hoovering will exploit attachment and longing, and the intermittent reinforcement will strengthen emotional dependency through unpredictability. And so over time, these patterns can erode your confidence. They will increase confusion, make you question yourself, and make it extremely hard to leave someone they'll make it harder to leave someone in the relationship. So some useful takeaways from these traits is that the most important question isn't whether someone is a narcissist or a sociopath. The more practical question is, do their repeated behaviors consistently leave you feeling confused, controlled, fearful, feeling diminished, or disconnected from your own judgment? The patterns of manipulation matter more than putting a label onto somebody. Although the label does feel good because it kind of helps to explain why, but it doesn't negate the behaviors that are happening. So let's talk about courtroom behavior. And this is where my forensic work becomes especially relevant because personality patterns don't disappear simply because someone enters a courtroom. Instead, the environment changes how these patterns may be expressed. So individuals with narcissistic or antisocial traits may attempt to control the narrative. They will appear exceptionally calm, and they will present themselves as the true victim. They will cry strategically or show little emotion depending on what they believe will persuade others. They will be charming towards attorneys, they will flatter investigators, and they will attempt to manipulate evaluators. And of course, they will minimize their own behavior, and they will exaggerate another person's actions. They will completely deflect responsibility, attack credibility, and recruit supporters so that there's more of them against you. And they'll present selectively edited text messages. And in custody disputes, children are often used to influence the custody, and they will seek revenge through prolonged litigation, so they will drag it on. But these behaviors are not unique to women. This is some things that women will do and also men as well. But they don't prove that someone has a personality disorder. These are things to look out for if you're in these situations or in a courtroom setting. And they should always be evaluated in the context of looking at all available evidence. So we'll talk about why female narcissists and those with antisocial personalities often go undetected. One of the main reasons is because society often expects women to be nurturing and empathetic. So when they're not, it's weird, and people have a hard time understanding that. And then because of that expectation, we struggle to recognize the manipulative behavior because we have this bias already preset in our minds. And then people can also dismiss the warning signs because they don't fit common stereotypes. So this is why professionals should focus on observable patterns over time versus the assumption based on gender or labels. Okay, so let's talk about why some female offenders go undetected. And this is one of the main reasons why this topic deserves more discussion, because female offenders are often overlooked, not because women cannot be manipulative or abusive, but because many people have deeply ingrained assumptions about gender when it relates to women. So, from an early age, society will often teach us that women are nurturing, they're caregiving, they're empathetic, and they're protectors. And then these expectations can shape how family members, friends, law enforcement, attorneys, jurors, and even mental health professionals will interpret their behavior. So when someone's actions don't fit our expectations, we may minimize, rationalize, or misinterpret what we're actually seeing. So, for example, when a man raises his voice, people may immediately perceive him as threatening. And when a woman uses emotional manipulation, social exclusion, false allegations, financial control, or psychological intimidation, those behaviors may be dismissed as relationship drama or personality conflict rather than recognized as potentially abusive. So, this does not mean that women are believed automatically, nor does it mean men are always viewed as aggressors. It just means that stereotypes can influence how evidence is interpreted, and sometimes this causes harmful behaviors by women to receive less scrutiny. And research has shown that women who offend are on average more likely than men to use indirect or relational forms of aggression. So these behaviors may include spreading rumors to damage reputations, manipulating social relationships, isolating someone from their friends or family, using guilt, shame, or humiliation to gain compliance, and controlling access to children, finances, or social support. They'll make repeated attempts or repeated threats to leave, threaten to expose secrets, or make false allegations as leverage. So they will present themselves as the perpetual victim while avoiding accountability. And these behaviors can be very, very damaging, more or as much as overt forms of abuse, such as physically abusing somebody. But because they don't leave visible injuries, they are often harder for people to recognize. And this is what people or psychologists call the halo effect, where people who are attractive, articulate, successful, or perceived as caring may be viewed more favorably, which makes them less likely to be suspected of manipulation or abuse. And this cognitive bias is not unique to women, but it can influence how someone's behavior is interpreted. So in forensic settings, investigators will also recognize that some offenders, regardless of male or female, are highly skilled at impression management. They know how to appear cooperative, emotional, calm, or credible when it serves their interest. And one misconception is that juries often only evaluate the facts, but in reality, they also evaluate people. Research in psychology has shown that first impressions, emotional expression, confidence, attractiveness, and gender expectations can all influence credibility judgments. So this is why one reason why forensic professionals emphasize corroborating evidence rather than solely relying on demeanor. Because someone who appears composed is not necessarily being truthful, and then someone who appears emotional is not necessarily being deceptive. And a person, as I discussed before with relationships, a person can present very differently in public than they do in private relationships. So this is why investigators, attorneys, and forensic evaluators need to look for patterns rather than isolated incidents. Always examine the timelines, the communications, financial records, witness statements, digital evidence, prior behavior, and consistency across multiple sources. A single emotional presentation in court is rarely enough to determine someone's credibility. So, as a forensic victimologist, one of the most important lessons that I've learned is that abuse should never be evaluated through the lens of gender. It should always be evaluated through the lens of behavior, evidence, context, and patterns. So, I just wanted to discuss that a little bit because, again, it's not an area where people typically think of. And like I said before, with gender biases, we often have preconceived notions as to how someone should act, and we have biases when it comes to offenders and what an offender looks like, um, and how they may act, especially with depending on the type of crime the offense is. Like, I think we automatically will have this idea of what this particular criminal would look like. If I'm being honest, I'll talk about some of my own biases when it comes to offenders. If it's a sex offender, I automatically assume that they are somebody creepy looking, and that just, when you look at them, you just know. That's not always the case. We often think of serial killers or psychopaths as being like that, like like a what's Jason Killer movie or Chainsaw Massacres or something like that, where they are just have that scary representation. But if you look at some serial killers, they are actually not scary looking and they look like normal people, which makes it really hard to figure out because your mind, it takes a little bit for your mind to process that somebody who looks this way could act that way. So don't judge people based on their looks. Observe the patterns of behaviors and then make your decisions based on the patterns of behaviors. Again, don't judge them by how they look, how they act. Judge based on the pattern of behaviors that have been displayed. Because, like I said before, what I find interesting with narcissists and sociopaths and psychopaths even is that it's basically like a cookie cutter clone. You can have a complete different person, man or woman, but the actions and their tactics are exactly the same across the board, which is so weird to me because it's like, how do you get people from complete different DNA, complete different environments, complete different upbringings, but yet I guess their programming, for lack of a better term, is exactly the same, no matter the person, but the traits and the behaviors are exactly the same. I find that so fascinating and so strange that once you run into one of them, you can pretty much predict the rest of them, in a sense. I had met somebody a while back who was explaining their relationship with their spouse. And it seemed like their spouse was like the female version of my ex-husband. The way they manipulated situations and did things was almost the exact person. It was just different bodies, same person, same mindset, same traits. So I find it very interesting. But yes, again, I appreciate you listening, and we will continue on with more topics.